Thank you. Okay, this is the January 19th, 2022 Finance Subcommittee of the Brookline School Committee. And we're going to jump into the agenda, which I need to pull up to refresh my memory. So bear with me for a second. First item is approval of minutes from the December 15th, 2021 meeting. I'm going to move them. Do we have a second? Thank you, David. Susan, how do you vote?
Yes.
Okay, David?
Yes.
And I vote yes. Thank you. Next time on the agenda, acceptance of gifts and grants. Let me see. Let me pull the.
And I'll let Dawn introduce that.
Great. Okay, Donna, if you want to go ahead for the gifts first.
You're muted.
Yes, sorry. Looters Environmental Inc., the recipients, Brookline High School, and that money is going to a student activity account, which is the Environmental Club, and historically has gone there as it's been received. The second is the Korean Church of Boston for the Public Schools of Brookline, the amount of $500, and that is going to the Brookline High School General Scholarship Fund.
Great, thanks.
Letters attached.
Do we have a motion for favorable action? Thank you, Susan. Second from you, David. Thank you.
Second.
Okay, how do you vote, Susan?
Yes.
I see. Okay, Stephen?
I don't know what we're voting on. I'm sorry.
That's okay. You're an abstention then, David?
Yes.
And I vote yes. Okay, next item is the grants. There's two grants.
First, the Fed. Oh, sorry.
I was going to let you do it, Dawn, as well. Great.
Okay, federal grant. It's this is a couple of attachments here, just explaining what the the grant is. It's a pandemic EBT program, and it actually was the money's been used to offset a salary from the Office of Strategy and Performance. That group worked on this program, I believe. Is that correct, Sam?
I'm sorry, say that again, Dawn, I apologize.
The monies were used to offset a salary.
Yes, is
for
this
one
the
of the individuals
7,000?
Yes, 7,982.
That is correct.
And the next one is a local grant, Project Bread, for $2,000. And that is going towards the school lunch program. It's actually going to be used, let me just see my notes here, towards the cost of a digital marketing board, which will show such things as recipes and menus.
In one of the schools?
For Tappan, Greenough, and Lincoln.
Oh, okay. Before we move on that, I just want to ask, there was no documentation, no backup for the pandemic EBT grant?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that because I went at the latest MASBO meeting. This is something that was passed through and just was, in fact, that's why I had to ask there, what is it for? And Jay Sullivan, Associate Commissioner, basically said, based on a webinar, it's used to provide offset, in our particular case, it's in, I think our communications department pushing information out is where it offsets some salary. And unfortunately, we really don't have a lot more than that. I'll look to chase some more down, but that's the best information we got. And it was more finding, we got the money first and then got the explanation later, which is unusual the way grants go with DESE.
It would be great, even if we have nothing, to whatever we have, to at least have an attachment.
No, fair enough.
Something.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, there was another sheet, so I'll make sure that it's on for the meeting tomorrow night.
Oh, okay. It just got,
Yeah.
it got excluded from our packet. Okay,
It
thank you.
may have.
I'll move favorable action. Oh, Susan, go ahead.
Yeah, just a very quick question. I just want to confirm, we're not hiring someone new or hiring a new 0.25. This is to
No.
okay, offset existing salary. I think it's just always helpful to say that when we're using a one-time grant for an ongoing salary expense in particular, because sometimes in the past it hasn't been clear to us if we were hiring an additional, in which case that was a new thing that we had to absorb in a future operating budget, or
No,
whether
it's-
it was the other. Yeah, okay, so thank you very much.
Yeah, it's the opposite issue where this is savings unanticipated for an expense we're committed to expending.
Sounds
The good kind of surprise.
The good kind.
Okay, I'm gonna move favorable action. Do I have a second?
One second.
Thanks. Okay, Susan, how do you vote?
Yes.
Stephen,
Yes.
David,
yes,
and I vote yes. Thank you. Next item on the agenda is FY22 budget, a second quarter financial report and proposed budget adjustments. I'm gonna pull the document up on the screen if that'd be helpful for people, so we can follow along, since this one.
Sure. And then
Okay,
I have
give me,
the hard copy in front of me to go off of as well.
great. Give me 1 second to pull it up. And I'll make it wider too.
Oh, actually, yeah, so, okay. Well, again, I'll on my screen without you lovely people taking a corner of my screen there. All right, so let me get to the doc that you have. There we go. Okay, here it is. So again, I'll not read it verbatim, but hit the highlights here. So in summary, we're on track, which is what we want and need to hear. The changes really at the appropriation, which is, the LEA level from last time. One thing to note, at mid-year, what we had the first quarter included, which isn't here, is the carryover of purchase orders from the previous year, which was $734,670. Just to update on that, they are largely expended with two provisions, one major, one not so major. The major provision that is still open, and I hope to close, and I think Helen's in the group here, not to target Helen, but this has to do with the EDCO closeout, and there are monies set aside that were carried over that would help offset a final settlement for Brookline's share of the closing of EDCO, which happened last fiscal year. Maybe later she can give an update, but at that point, that's still being carried and open. Not reflected in this, but it's separately carried still. To a lesser extent, is some transportation open encumbrances that I'm working with Matt Gillis to close out. And to an even lesser extent, some tuition reimbursements for tuitions that happened in the spring that should have closed by now, and I'm working with Kelly Durgan, NOTL, to close those. The expectation is certainly by March, it should be done. If there's any monies left at that point, they would revert, but otherwise, all the fiscal 21 carryovers would be closed. What you see here is the number of the appropriation has gone up. The 121,066,547 is inclusive of what town meeting allocated in November, $1,196,071, which was the school department's proportional share based on the partnership of an additional approximate $2 million revision in budgeted revenue by the town administrator for FY22. And so that is where that number now comes from. What you see spent and encumbered is roughly $53.5 million, or roughly 44% of the total 121 million. We're 50% of the year done. We're a little less than 50% of the year expended and encumbered. That makes sense largely because teacher salaries are a little back-end loaded, given that they're paid ratably between September and June, not July and June. The highlights, again, I fully expect that we're going to finish balanced and fully expended. 3 areas worth talking about that are bulleted at the end of the summary are all the collective bargaining agreements are unsettled except for Unit C. And in this budget of 121 million is a reserve carried over from last year in the cases of Unit AB, and what's appropriated for this year in the case of all the units but C, but haven't been settled yet. Of course, settlements, we don't know what those will be. I'm hopeful that whatever those settlements are will be in line with what's carried as a reserve. Second, special ed out of district placements. We have 79. The plan was for 80. Clearly, that's not a lot of margin, but we're at least halfway through the year. And so hopeful that we won't have many more, and that should be on plan. Lastly, the major revolving funds, and I'm highlighting BEEP, base, school nutrition, that they're not going to finish the year in a deficit. Base clearly might be an issue, and I think that's spoken to later. But then right now, school nutrition is looking favorable, and my sense is those would hopefully wash. Moving on to the LEA at the bottom of page 1, that's a great place to stop, Mariah, is again, the top line there is the 121,066,547. That's what town meeting appropriates. Our budget all in, and this will be important when we begin to talk about comparing our 23 ask request preliminary budget to what our current budget is for an operating budget, which it's really not the 121, it's more like the 129, because the 129 includes roughly $5 million that was planned for ESSER money, as well as $2.3 million for circuit breaker money, as well as $500,000 using materials fee money. And then you get that top line of about $129 million. So just explaining all the moving parts. It's really a four-legged stool. Appropriation, ESSER, circuit breaker, materials fee. Moving on to the next page. Again, as of this writing, I expect ESSER 2 will be expended. ESSER 3, and this is part of what will be next year's budget, is, we have some favorable this year. Again, we planned on having ESSER funds available between 2 and 3 of 5 million. It's 5 1/3 million because of 300 grand that we thought was going to be spent for tents. Those tent expenses did occur, but were paid out of F21 operating. So that freed up some money in ESSER. We also have better circuit breaker reimbursement than we anticipated by 800,000. Those two pieces are $1.1 million. And right now that's still holding. Therefore, all things being equal, I'm anticipating, and you'll see it further, $1 million of ESSER 3 I anticipate will be left over and will carry to FY23, which is going to buffer and did buffer the ask for F23. And so it's important to note that here, certainly we're going to look to see if we can even save more money, and I'll speak to that a little further, but at least $1 million is a good placeholder. Getting to the special revenue funds. There are 53 special revenue funds, and again, to recap, they're basically in 4 categories. Your You have your revolving funds, which are your BEEP, your base, athletics. These are funds, by definition, we collect revenues, we have expenses, and the balances can carry, they can't finish in deficit. And so if base, for example, had a deficit, it can't finish in deficit. The operating budget would have to absorb it. You can carry surpluses, but state law governs some limits on how much money you can carry year over year. Entitlement grants are just those. They're entitlement grants for Brookline for 2022, inclusive of ESSER 3. That number rested at about $7 million, $7,049,455 to be exact. Some that was ESSER 3 included. Some other ARP money was included. Most typically, and prior to a pandemic, METCO adds to that, so that $7 million METCO is another $2 million, and so you're about $9 million. The things that are non-pandemic that are typical is your titles, Title 1, 2, 3, and 4, Individual with Disabilities Education Act, the METCO program. ESSER again is pandemic unique. Competitive grants are your Brookline Education Foundation, BHS Innovation Fund, and then special revenue, which is fairly recent. When I say recent, within the past 6-8 years or so, maybe 10 years, is your circuit breaker. Again, in summary, they're all tracking. They will not finish in deficit. I do put a proviso on base. Last year, it finished at a $200,000 deficit. I am saying it's potential to finish in that kind of deficit. Again, I'm continually meeting with the director, Michelle McGlone. Clearly, I think there was a hope that we wouldn't be this far along still with COVID. And so that has really provided challenges in how those programs are delivered and how people enroll. But I meet monthly. We're looking to do as best as we can to mitigate any deficit. Moving onward, as I promised last quarter, I was going to expand or expound upon some of the particular programs, largely the entitlement grants, including ESSER. And so in ESSER, basically it's saying again, you know, we got 3 2/3 million this year for ESSER, what's called ESSER 3. That's the money that can carry all the way up through fiscal 2025, September of 30th of 24 to be specific. That would be a problem I'd like to have. I think we're going to spend it sooner than that, but not as soon as we first thought, which would have been by June of 22. We're going to carry, I'll go as far as to say, I'm hoping at least $1 million into F23. And that, again, that is factored into next year's request. METCO, as of this writing, we received an initial allocation of $2,132,433. I'm pleased to report that right after I hit the send button, there was a supplemental appropriation of about another $160,000, which will be reflected in next quarterly's report. So that number is now closer to 2.3 million, FYI. Again, that's tracking very well, and I'm working with Keith Lazama and Donna Scott and Kelly Durgan to keep that on track, and Donna Chisholm to keep that on track. IDEA, the total is, including ARP funds of roughly $500,000, American Rescue Plan, one time, is $2.7 million. The 2.2 of the 2.7 is funding 40 paras and summer program, extended school year. The 490 is still being worked on with Casey to provide additional supports where necessary. I'll be able to give them more up to date at the next quarter because that was fairly recent, those monies coming in for ARP. And then lastly, the titles 1, 2, 3, and 4, when you add them all up, it's real money, but small compared to these other buckets. It's a little over $500,000. And Title 1 is for economically disadvantaged, providing supports to level the playing field. Teacher training is 2A, largely mentor stipends is where that gets paid for. ELE or ELL is where Title 3 gets funded, and then Title 4 is generally in the area of technology support. Moving on, other items to note. I'm getting near the end because we still have a lot more to cover, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Really, the key here, and let me do my we're on track. Again, the best thing I can say, and it's important, is we're on track except for the provisos with not having settled contracts. There is a cash deficit with some of the grants, but that's not unexpected because the way cash draws occur, you spend the money, then you go and you get reimbursed, and you catch up in June generally. So, none of the grants are overspent. That would be a concern, but that's not a concern because none of the grants are overspent. It's just a timing issue. I want to highlight that since the last writing, and I might have mentioned this in school committee, because you had to accept the grant, was a $200,000 summer programming grant that I would call this a competitive grant. This was not an entitlement grant. And so I try to keep an eye out for any kind of additional funding opportunities. And I found this one. And then I worked with the OTL and OSS department because I knew we qualified. And we applied and got the maximum amount we could, which was $200,000. And I'm really pleased because these monies will help offset monies. These expenses occurred last summer and now can move from the ESSER funds to this grant, which then will free up additional capacity for FY23. And so again, we're continuing to scour where we can, but wanted to highlight that because that's notable. Happy to answer any other questions that anybody may have, but at this point, I think that completes this particular report. And then there's a corresponding Google sheet that basically provides more detail that was summarized in the narrative that we went over.
Thank you, Sam. Questions from the committee or other members of the school committee? Sam, I just wanted to say that I think you sold yourself short, if I recall correctly, because didn't you also get the other grant? You and Fung worked on that other grant for another 100 and something thousand that you didn't list at the end.
Oh yes, there was funding through through the Universal Service Fund through USAC, where I want to give Fung really the credit. And also.
So you sold Fung short.
I sold short. No, she did a wonderful job with Scott Moore piecing that together. But you're right, that was also to provide Chromebooks largely to paraprofessionals, so they would have one-to-one Chromebooks. Thank you for reminding me, Mariah.
Sure. Thank you for making it happen, you and Fung and Scott. Any comments from the committee or from our guests from advisory?
Just to say thank you, Sam. This is very, very clear and it's all trending in the right direction. So thank you.
Carla? You're still on mute.
Sorry,
There you go.
okay. Does the school committee, I'm sorry to have to ask this question, but does the school committee have a policy or a definition of a revolving fund?
Oh, that's probably for Mariah. I will say it's, the only reason I interjected is it does, I've heard it mentioned here as special revenue funds, but I think revolving fund might be a legal term for some of these by statute.
The reason I asked is because I remember last year, a couple of the revolving funds running into difficulties and the school committee voting to provide funds to make them solvent again. And I just wondered how, whether there isn't some way to prevent that from happening in the future by providing some sort of cushion. I mean, I know nonprofits are supposed to have 6 months worth of operating expenses in their bank accounts. And I don't know whether that's an applicable rule for a revolving fund or not, but I know the town has revolving funds, the recreation department in particular. And they fortunately had enough of a cushion last year so that they did not have to come to the town for additional funding. But I also know that they did lay off some of their part-time people. You clearly can't lay off people in BEEP or the school nutrition program, but I do wonder about the Brookline BACE.
It's my understanding that base is down to perhaps 3 FTEs from, it's in the budget book, actually. There was a whole discussion about the staffing situation in base, and I remember we talked about it last year too. And Sam, you might have those numbers sort of top of brain, but
I think
they're significantly downstaffed. But go ahead, Sam.
I would agree. They have a director, they have a couple of part-time clerical positions. I think they have a very part-time program manager. And this year I was looking to bring on a full-time program manager just because, and Mariah and I spoke about this, if you cut it so far, then you're basically dooming to a program to failure. You need a minimum level of infrastructure, but yeah, it's compared to where it was in the past. I agree. You know, the program was much more robust in revenue in the past. With respect to reserves, again, as I had mentioned, statute allow you to carry in a lot of cases. I think for food service, you're only allowed to carry up to 3 months worth of gross revenue by statute. Other revolvers, you can carry up to a year's worth of revenue as a reserve. That's ideal. We're not there yet. That's certainly my goal. And I guess I'd leave it at that at this point. I agree. That's a goal. That's a laudable goal.
Before Helen, I call on you. I just want to say that Sam and I discussed having base as a topic, an agenda item under next month's meeting to hear from Michelle and Sam on some more detail on how things are going, given the ongoing challenges and the fact that there is a forecasted deficit again. So that would be next month. Helen, I saw your hand was up.
Carla, this may seem obvious, and I think you probably know, but those deficits are totally COVID related. In BEEP, we had to cut the number of kids who could be in the program in half in order to be able to function full-time from September through the end of the year. So we made a decision that it was, first of all, we had to provide services for kids with disabilities, but also we made a decision it was important as much as we could to have BEEP function. And we knew that it was going to cut into their budget by half. And that's why I kept on pushing Melissa that this was a loss due to COVID and should be part of the revenues that she put together for COVID related expenses.
Susan and then David.
Thanks, Mara. So I think there's a, just in the spirit of trying to bring some institutional memory, revolving funds are something that we probably need to put on the agenda going forward to be addressed more holistically. Certainly there are some things that by statute have to be revolving funds, and there are other things that for a variety of reasons we might choose to have revolving funds. There's also a question about synchronizing the things that we have as revolving funds with what the town has as revolving funds. And sometimes they sync up and there are definitely gaps or different definitions, which we've talked about in the past. And so when we go through and do have that sort of rebalancing, it's probably important to check with how the town is doing it as well. There's also there's sort of a lot of statutory guidance about what you can and can't put on into a revolving fund versus what has to be in your operating budget. And if I remember correctly, and I'm not going to get the exact language right, but you can't have different assumptions, for example, of how much overhead you allocate to one revolving fund than from a different one. So like custodial services or anything else like that, which is complicated for us because we really do have very different things going on strategically with each of our revolving funds. And there are some, for example, like BEEP or like the athletic funds, or frankly, like food services, where strategically we've made choices in the past to not increase lunch prices, not increase athletic prices because of the burden we think it would put on families. We've done benchmarking with other towns, and we've done other kinds of questions of where we think we want to be, extensive conversations on BEEP, where we want to be relative to other providers, relative to the services they offer, the number of hours they offer. And yet, if we need to have a consistent definition of what we're allocating to which revolving funds, which has been a real issue with BASE as well. So all of which is to say that we do have to kind of look at it a little bit more holistically and make some choices. And then think again pretty carefully about where is it that we want to restrict the price we're going to, or the revenue we're going to charge, and where are there places where we might have more flexibility. BASE is one where flexibility has been discussed, where subsidy of BASE does not feel like as high a priority as subsidy of meal prices, for example. So I do think that there's a larger conversation on that one, Carla, just because we need to make some of those decisions, especially since we now have a new administration in place.
I just want to add one sort of historical memory on that date before we get to you, David, which is, it's my recollection, and this is that town meeting had to approve the establishment of the school bus fund revolving fund last year or 2 years ago. And that brought up a question of even whether any of our other revolving funds, apparently none of them had been essentially voted in. And so they're all sort of technically in a legal netherworld. And so I agree with you, Susan, and we should put it on for a future. I mean, obviously we've been working up to this budget, so a whole bunch of stuff, we haven't wanted to dilute people's attention towards what needed to be happen, but this is something that we should be closing as part of the whole financial policy discussion, which has been on hold. David, go ahead.
Just to offer a specific answer to Carla's question, we do have a current policy regarding revolving funds. You can find it on D11 of the Public Schools of Brookline Policy Handbook. It's titled Fiscal Accounting, Revolving Funds, Reporting, Audits, and Use of Surplus Funds. It's somewhat broad. There are probably some associated procedures with it. But if you would like to look at the current policy, that's where you can find it.
Thank you very much.
Anything else on Q2? Okay, so we will continue on to the next item on the agenda, which is FY23 budget development. And before we start, and that includes a discussion of the proposed user fees and a potential vote. Before we start, I want to say that because the official school committee presentation is tomorrow night, in my head, this is the way I'm thinking we're dividing the things that we talk about today versus tomorrow, which is today I'm sort of thinking about like, sorry, I muted myself. As we think about, structurally, like reacting to sort of the document, do we have sort of comments on it structurally, knowing that it's been disseminated in probably at least a limited run has already been printed. Am I correct, Sam, Linus, on if it's actually already gone to print yet or not necessarily? Oh, there we go. Okay. So Zoom tells us, yes, it's gone to print. It's come back from printing. But in general, just, providing comments on structure, giving that feedback, but not necessarily expecting to go through in great detail today, because we'll have the opportunity to do that officially tomorrow during the presentation at school committee. Does that sort of division of labor between today and tomorrow work for people? It might mean that you're all sort of like frustrated and holding your questions, and maybe some of the questions come up today, but sort of as a preview, and we say, I'm thinking about this, and then it gives Linus and Sam some time to possibly react to it for tomorrow as well. Susan, I saw your hand was up.
Yeah, no, that's fine. We normally do the more detailed comments here and then the more broad comments, but it's fine with me if you want to flip it. I guess my only question is, it might be helpful to just remind us and about the pathway from here in terms of us making comments, how long the administration has to turn them around, when we're going to get sort of a final. I definitely appreciate that there was a limited run that went on already, but just remind us of the calendar of what happens next.
So then on the calendar, the sort of the key dates were tomorrow. Well, the first key date is passed, which was Friday, and we got the book, which was great. Yay, exactly. And then the second key date is tomorrow, the presentation by the superintendent to the school committee, along with a initial public comment specifically on the budget for sort of early reactions from people. Then the next big date after that is February 3rd, which is the public hearing. And then the final date is the vote on the 10th. Now, I don't have an answer particularly on this back and forth question. I'm not sure to what extent, and I will let Linus and or Sam respond to how much wiggle room there is on sort of like what Susan's asking, which is, if we have requested changes, how are you responding to feedback and requests for change between over the next until February 10th? What's the venue, et cetera, for that?
So certainly, so thank you again, and thank you to the team for your hard work and pulling this together. It certainly was, it felt like a Herculean task at times. And I can tell you, sitting up at 2 o'clock in the morning and then getting back at 5 o'clock to review and all of those good things, we all go through it. So I think I would say it depends, right? So if there are, high level types of, shift this around, those types of things, that's one level of pieces there. But if we're talking about the substance, then I think that's the back and forth where I need guidance from the entire committee on those types of things. But we're certainly open to the suggestions that will make it most user friendly. And certainly my vision, and I'll talk about this a little bit more tomorrow night, was to leverage this budget book as a teaching tool, an information tool for the community, something that's digestible, and then at the same time at a high enough level, because we do have a partner in this, and that partner is OpenGov. So my vision was that a high level, we have the big codes or the big buckets or chunks, and then the fanning out or the spreading out needs to happen in OpenGov. I think also that this being version 1 of this book right now, our goal is to get it much more efficient over time, but also as a marketing item also, so that folks that are picking this up can see what we're about as an institution. Where do we place our priorities as such? So that's the broad level thinking, but certainly, I stand excited to hear the feedback and the questions that you have, so that we can make it much more lucid as possible, much more lucid where needed as well.
Susan, do you want to respond to that in any way before I go on to Stephen?
I think that makes absolute sense. And so maybe, Mariah, like when we're hearing things, when you're hearing things and trying to sort of distill them, it might be important to say, here are the things that are really critical to do, even if they take some work, versus a whole lot of things that would be extra analysis, improvements for next year. So things that are critical, and then things that are easy, because my guess is that some things are going to be quite easy to fix, and not, less than a couple hours of time. But I think distinguishing critical versus not critical will be helpful guidance for the senior team. So that makes sense to me.
And I guess what I want to be super sensitive to the reality of how much time people will have to implement. So I guess what is our definition of critical? And I'm going to give a really bare bones definition of critical, which is I won't vote yes for the budget unless you change this. To me, could be one definition of critical versus. And I guess I'm sort of throwing that out there as, is that something that, should we ask people to say, like, this is an absolute no-go for me versus this is something that really is important for me to see in your version 2.0 of the FY24, which would be our FY24 budget. You see what I'm saying? Like, I'm just trying to be realistic about what the next 2 weeks can actually do without having Linus and team going to bed at 2 a.m. and waking up at 5 a.m. because that's not right. So do we, is my definition of critical an acceptable definition, or what is it? Can we just come to a common definition of critical in this group?
I mean, everyone should speak for themselves. That works for me. I guess the only thing that I would say is that it may be worth our at least putting in writing or by comments our ideas out, and then if there's something critical, like you said, like an absolute deal breaker, that would be good to know. But I also think that allowing, explaining any of our thinking on it, and then Linus and Sam and team can kind of figure out what to do with it. As again, whether if it's easy to do, that's one thing, but if it's tons of new analysis, then that's something different. So,
Sam and Linus, do you want committee members to provide feedback, written feedback, sort of, it could be line edits, and those could be really easy. Someone caught a typo, you might actually want to just tweak that. Do you want people to provide, wait a little bit, please. Do you want people to provide that to you all? And then for them to sort of call out which ones of these are actual deal breakers so that you can then triage that?
That's certainly helpful for me if that's the process that you're accustomed to.
I don't know what we're accustomed to.
I'm happy to,
and what
I'm
we're
happy to
accustomed
work
to
with
might
it.
not be good for you. So let's let's reach a new normal together, I guess, is, so that works for you. So we'll make sure that the whole committee understands that what we're really asking for is ASAP call out any deal breakers that will impede their positive vote on the 10th. And then any other comments they want to provide for you to address if it's easy this year, or going forward, something we can iterate on for 2.0 next year. Okay, great. There was someone who had their hands up and okay, thanks, Stephen.
Thanks, Mariah. 2 comments. One, I don't think it makes sense to say that that it has to be like veto level for it to be critical. I think it's just the best faith, high priority, and then administration just figures out the extent to which you could deal with it. Because otherwise you're presenting political ultimatums in this process. That just seems counterproductive to me. That's my comment on that. One other comment is I still, and Mariah, I think we're aligned on this. I still want to make sure that community feedback is meaningful and that there's the opportunity, and not just for our feedback to be considered, but for community feedback to be considered. And given the unbelievable work you put into this budget book, the amount of transparency you've created, I wonder if it's possible to have an additional session that's like an office hour session, maybe with the finance subcommittee and or with Sam, just to answer questions about the budget book, because I think the public engagement part of this process is really about community advocacy. And it would be great if that process could be as scrubbed of clarifying questions as possible, because I think no one is accustomed to this level of transparency. People are going to have a zillion questions about what's in here. There's going to be misinterpretations. The more that people could just be on point in what they think is the best direction for the school, for BSB to take with their budget, the better. So what I'm suggesting, Mariah, is I'm presuming we're going to do a little bit of community outreach around their opportunity to provide comments. I wonder if there's an opportunity also for them just to attend a office hours with Sam and Mariah or the subcommittee. Oh, Susan objects.
No, amen. So
Oh.
One thing that I think is really important is to figure out exactly what has to get finalized before February 10th and what it is that we're voting and what things, because the revenue numbers are going to change, all kinds of things are going to change over the course of February 10th through June 30th. And so I think the vote we're taking is important because there's a whole bunch of time between February 10th and town meeting, for example, when we're going to be iterating this. Hopefully we will do as we've done before. We've done some town halls. We're going to be talking to the advisory committee. We'll be talking to a variety of different folks to hear things, not just our public hearing. And so I think understanding that piece of it as well, because I think if we vote what we used to do is vote categories, and then kind of within the categories things moved. For a while, which I did not agree with, we voted one bottom line number, and then basically the administration kind of did what they wanted within there. And so I think just getting that clear so that people understand things will change between February 10th and town meeting at least. But amen to what you said, and I think we need to actually plan that out between February and May. There's sort of a bunch of things that go in there.
And to that point, on the February 16th agenda is, let me read it so I get the exact wording right, but it's planning for budget presentations to AC and others. So this exact topic. And I think to Susan's point, the February 10th vote is whether it's a bottom line number or whether it breaks it down by 4 categories, which are very large and almost bottom line. That is, that certainly does offer room for wiggling around in the middle of, like, there's opportunity for plenty of change. And so we can do something like that. Sam, would you be open to an office hours like session or two with me?
Yes, my short answer is yes. I have a question though related to timeline and my experience, not that that means a lot here, but timeline. Isn't there a charter timeline where a number has to go to the town, and that's February of what?
February 15th,
Okay. And
which is
that's
why we
not-
vote on the 10th.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that's what I'm used to. Okay. With respect to whether it's categories, my experience is because town meeting ultimately votes a top line, and that statute is the committee generally, in my experience, votes a top line with an understanding that what they see of how the top line is allocated is generally going to be what gets put into the accounting system. I guess there's a level of trust at that point that nothing's going to change a whole lot from the time it's presented, or at least it's acknowledged at the time that the motion is put out, and then that's what goes in. And again, Brookline may be incredibly different, but
What we did
that's
last
sort of
year,
the
if I
use-
recall, which I think works and sort of ties in with what you're saying, is we voted the bottom line number in February, and then before town meeting, we re-voted as a school committee all 5 lines, like the 5 sublines plus the bottom line number, which had, morphed over time as things change, as is expected. And so that would achieve both what you're talking about, Sam, but then also give school committee that sort of final say later on. Does that work for people in terms of our process for February 10th and then beyond? And then also would give, to Stephen's point, some opportunity to, we'll have a bottom line number to present in the different, which we need to by statute, but we'll also have some opportunity to reflect and receive feedback and modify things as we see fit.
Right, can I just add, so 2.3 is public comment. So I think it would be really helpful if
120 is public comment and 2.3 is the official public hearing. There's 2 opportunities.
Thank you, that's right,
Yep.
I'm sorry. So.
I interrupted you. I just wanted to make sure we had both of
Thanks
those
for
on the
bringing
record.
that up. So so is there public comment on 2.3 or no?
Yes, that's the official, you have to by law have a public hearing that gets noticed. So that one is the public hearing that's official. And then we also this week have a public comment to give more time between, for again, feedback.
So my
from
only
the public.
suggestion here is that we have an information session or office hours a day or two before 2.3, so that my goal is for the public comment on the 3rd to be as action oriented as possible, rather than an information session that that crowds out opportunity for community groups to advocate for what they think needs to be in the budget.
Thanks. Great. Other comments on process, et cetera, over the next 3 weeks, whatever it is? Yeah, I think it's 3 weeks.
Then as far as tomorrow's concerned, are there any votes or required votes? Or tomorrow is just strictly at the informational level?
Yes, the latter. Okay, so if we don't have anything else to talk about here, again, I think how many of us are here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Who isn't here?
Jennifer.
Oh, Jennifer.
Yeah.
Okay. So 8 of the 9 of us are here. So I'm not going to ask you all to send in your notes. You're just going to send in your notes to Sam and Linus and call out anything that's critical, mission critical, that you would be unable to vote for a budget presented in X way. And feel free to like triage them in other ways too, you know, something you think that's really important for the public to have a perception of, you know, whatever it is. I certainly have shared comments back with Linus and Sam, or at least with Linus over the weekend, about things that I thought would be valuable to modify. And I'll follow up with Susan. Yeah, Andy.
Yeah, could someone remind me, if we were to vote on like 4 or 5 sub top lines rather than one top line, what those would be? I don't remember this from last year.
It's personnel, services, materials and supplies, other, and equipment.
Those are the 5. That
I
is
see.
correct.
Those are so general that voting on those doesn't seem like it would give us more of a grip on the budget than simply voting the top line, right?
Which is sort of what I said. They're almost each like their own top line
Yeah,
practically.
okay.
Yeah. Especially personnel. I mean,
Yeah.
it's whatever, 85% of the budget. So, okay. Why don't we can come back to this if anyone has any further comments, but I want to make sure that we talk about fees, which is the next item in the agenda, and spend some time on that. I'm going to
Great.
pull up the memo and I'm just going to skim through it because it's multiple pages.
And I have it up too, and I might be able to sort of I need to walk through it.
Why don't I pull it up and you can talk up while I
Excellent.
scroll so you can see at the same time.
Excellent. So the first page is a summary with respect to the kind of fees, and really here what it talks about is the anticipated or expected or hoped for gross revenue that these fees generate. So again, looking at it, you know, just eyeballing it in total, and of course, base is the big wild card, right? So, and that's $1 million swing high to low. And right now I'm projecting $500,000, which is sort of in the middle, a little lower middle. And if you look at all these fees, $1 million, $1.3 million, $4 million, $7 million, it's about $8 million worth of fees across everything, to give you a perspective. Now moving down into, and really the rest speak to their legal reference under Mass General laws. I think, you know, that explain in some ways what the type of fees are. What I'd like to get to is where we get to the grid, you know, and now we're down to page 5. You know, I mean, the transcripts, I mean, these fees are
Those are sort of
minor in
standard, right?
nature. Yeah, I mean, I really want to get, page 5. Now, let me say this, overarching this. Certain fees, and this is an important conversation. There are fees that are waived by statute, and then there are fees that are waived or reduced. I'm sorry, waived or reduced in both cases by statute. And there are fees that are waived and reduced by Brookline being Brookline and being generous and compassionate with its financial assistance program. And I'll speak to those unique differences. With respect to statute, it's really only 2 fees that are governed by statute. One is, and one drives the other. free or reduced lunch. You're either free or reduced lunch. So yeah, and then we'll go back to the top. School lunch. And Mariah, I didn't get an answer yet, but I'm still going with my gut feel. But I got calls into 3 people at DESE, and I'll explain what Mariah asked for. Statute for free or reduced lunch is based on the federal poverty rate for a family 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever it is. And if you're below 130% of the poverty level, you're considered eligible for free lunch and breakfast for that matter, and free is free. And if you're eligible for free or reduced lunch and breakfast, you're automatically free from paying busing fees. Again, that's the law. We cannot charge where we have a bus run and we charge a fee. If you're eligible for free or reduced lunch, you're free for that too. Reduced is if you have income that's more than 130% of the poverty level and less than 100, up to 185% or less than 185% of the poverty level. And what reduced means is for breakfast, it's reduced is like almost free. So reduced is 30 cents for breakfast and 40 cents, as you can see, for lunch. And Mariah was like, well, why do we bother? Why don't we just say it's free? And my sense is, but I'll get clarification, is we would risk losing all of our federal funding for school lunch because, you know, they have this for a reason and we have to collect it for a reason. But I'll know for certain by the end of the week. But this is a federal program and these rates aren't set by Sam Rippin for this, it's set by the USDA. Moving upwards to the top of this schedule. And then were there other fees that are waived through the financial assistance program? I'll speak to that as I go through these, as well as what the change, if any, is in the fee next year versus this year, okay? Athletics, we charge $300 a sport, that isn't changing. And our financial assistance program, which is more generous than the free or reduced lunch parameters. If you're making less than 200% of the poverty line, athletics is free. If you make between 200 and I think 300% of the poverty line, it's 75% off. So it would only be, in this case, $75. If you make less than 400%, and again, it might be a little, I think it's either 200, 300, 400 or 200, 250, 300, but it's much higher than the free and reduced lunch by definition, by design. You get either a 50% discount, 100% discount, a 50%, a 75% discount, or a 50% discount, or no discount. And so again, in this particular case, athletics is one of the fees that is subject to this assistance program. It could be $0, $75, or $150, depending on your financial situation. Middle school extramurals, no change in the fee, the same assistance would apply. Materials fee is not subject to that. This is recommended for a 2% increase. This is for people who are entitled to have, that don't live in Brookline, aren't part of the METCO program, but have an entitlement to enroll their student or their child into the Brookline Public Schools. This is the fee that is charged. International fee, these are largely for the China program, not China Exchange. China Exchange, they come for a little bit. We don't charge them. Some of our students go to China for a little bit. They don't charge us. This is somebody comes from China for a whole year and they pay. And this and the fee here is a 3% increase. I'm not so sure that we're going to have anybody. We have sent in the renewal paperwork with CVIS, which is the federal agency that manages this. I think it's student exchange, visitor, yeah. But we're waiting till with a pandemic. Bus fee, that's remaining unchanged. They talked about that. Use of school buildings, our fees aren't changing. That clearly could be a meeting in and of itself. Probably should be a meeting in and of itself. It won't be this meeting. That being said, we're anticipating about 300,000 in revenue. That's certainly down from what it would normally be, but again, we don't know what COVID's going to do with accessibility. It's really hampered it this year. BEEP tuition, we're looking at a 2% increase. That's not going to keep up with our costs. However, we're sensitive that it's not a full day program. And given that it's not a full day program, I think it's a 4-hour-a-day program. We're sensitive to where that price point is. And BEEP has their own financial assistance program. We do give, it's important to note that we give 40 free tuition scholarships to people in Brookline, which is higher than it's been historically. And we can afford, right now the budget is built to continue that program, but not expand it. And that is tied to some extent to our financial assistance program. School lunch we talked about. Summer school program, no change.
Sam, could I ask you
Yes.
a quick question on the school lunch? So
Sure.
are the
Oh, I'm sorry,
feds,
premiums going up. Sorry, but yeah, ask your question, Ellen.
yeah, now are the feds paying again this year for the school lunches?
Yes, they are 100%. They're paying 100%. They're considering everybody free. And they've given some extra monies. Most recently, we're anticipating another couple $100,000 to cover the increased cost of food, because of supply chain interruption.
Right.
But thank you for stopping me, because even though our prices aren't changing, because I did some benchmarking, and honestly, our benchmark prices are similar to the Lexingtons, even where I was in Dedham, even though I wouldn't consider Dedham a benchmark in this regard. But the Lexingtons and the Newtons I would. But Matt Gillis, who I respect a lot, said, well, they have food service management companies. We have a self-op and our own employees. I think it costs us a little bit more to run. And my feeling is it may cost us a little bit more to run, but I think this isn't the great time to raise school lunch, at least not for things that are standard.
No.
Things that are not standard, we're going up because food cost is going, if you can buy, we'll call it the extreme lunch, then I guess you can pay the full cost. We can't subsidize it with standard lunches. And so in the summer program, it's called Summer Service Option. Our anticipation, and we've signed up for it, is it'll be free summer lunches and summer, all summer feeding program will be free, but we're going under the assumption, although it could change, as you know, that starting in September, it would be pre-pandemic pricing.
Oh, I see. So this is, for next year. I see.
This is for next year. Nobody's paying for a standard lunch this year. You're buying a premium lunch, that's not free. Government isn't covering that.
Okay.
Can you clarify what a premium lunch is in K-8? I feel like I've missed the existence of premium lunch in K-8.
I figure you would clarify to me because you have a
My
child.
children do not report on premium lunch. So I would love to know what premium lunch means.
I don't think it is in the K-8. I think it's only
Mostly
in the high school.
I would say it's mostly high school, but
But it's
does
here.
exist. And I expect it exists.
But what
for
is
me,
it?
I'll tell you in my past, it could be you get boar's head sandwich. If they do a sandwich, you get an extra slice of pizza, which would then put it into premium category. Those are the kind of typical things that would push something into into a premium offering, but I'll get back to you. I can try to even get back to you tomorrow. I'll get back to you tomorrow because we're going to revisit tomorrow to some extent, and certainly by the 3rd or the 10th, I'll have better explanation on both of those. Certainly, the high school has much more of a breadth of program than the K-8s. We talked about summer school, academic testing. This is really AP exams. It's set by the College Board.
Can I ask a question? This isn't about the cost of summer school, but
Mhm.
this is about why they are all virtual. Like why, like what does it mean if virtual, 2.5-hour class if virtual? And then are we saying that it's definitely virtual? Are we saying that it's not? What if it's not virtual? I don't understand what this means.
Oh, that's a fair question. I mean, I'm clearly last summer it was virtual. I expect this coming summer it may or may not be. I don't think the price is going to be any different because the cost is going to not be any different. We're paying people to deliver the content either way. So I think that's confusing. Donna, maybe you can help, not to put you on the spot.
Did this come up at curriculum at all? I think curriculum was talking about summer programming, weren't they?
I don't know if the decision's been made whether the summer school at the high school is going to be virtual or not. So we put if virtual. It would
But if it's
remain
not
at that same
virtual, is the
price.
price changing?
I'm not anticipating that personally.
Okay, maybe it would be great to get some clarity on.
I will.
Okay, thanks. Sorry to interrupt you.
No
just while we were
worries.
there.
This is helpful, and Donna, I'll take notes too. Testing fees, it's largely AP exams.
Can I say one other thing about summer school?
Sure.
Two things. First, we've always had a deficit in summer school. Somehow it's never been able to pay for itself. That being said, at times or in the past, we used to allow non-residents to attend it on a space available basis. I don't know if that's still happening, and I think there was a higher fee for non-residents. Most schools.
I would expect that. Yeah, it makes sense, Helen.
Yeah, so I
Higher
would check
fee.
that piece too along when you straighten up this whole grid.
No, duly noted. I don't know with well, maybe virtual you could do the same thing, I suppose. It might even be easier to have non-residents. You just give them yeah. Okay, no, thank you. Testing.
Can I ask one more question? Sorry, this one, is it also prorated on on the same sorts of prorated that you mentioned for athletics?
Summer school isn't something that I think financial assistance historically has really been, and you and I have talked offline about this, Mariah. I mean, the funding's just to fund BEEP, what BEEP gives, and luckily that program balances on its own without having to tap into the funding that's in the operating budget set aside for financial assistance. But athletics, a good deal of money. That's probably the biggest cost driver after BEEP, as well as the busing. I guess the question, and this isn't a big fund. I mean, as I look at 20,000 as expected, it certainly could be. I'm not sure that has been a program that's been identified as. But I would say this, and again, this could be a whole nother conversation and maybe should be. I'd be shocked if any student in Brookline was denied access because of an inability to pay a particular fee. Especially, that I'll go on record as saying that, but generally the fees in the application, I think, field trips is another. The fees that are generally reduced or waived in financial assistance are athletics, busing, and field trips, and the others, I don't think so much, unless it's on a case-by-case basis.
I think that's what that says here. Right? Is
See,
that, I'm sorry, where is it? It's not there. There's somewhere that it says, here it is.
should
all
have all
PSB.
access, yeah.
I guess
And
I
I-
just wanted to be clear that like that also applies to, I mean, it's kind of I'm sure an unintentional message if we give waivers of fees to athletics, but we don't give waivers of fees for academics.
No, I agree. And
Okay.
again, I'm not aware of any situation where a student has been shut out of anything in this list because of an inability to financially pay for it or family inability.
Didn't we do a
Sometimes-
policy? Didn't we do a policy on this like very recently? Because this was exactly an issue of making sure that we had the right categories covered. David might remember, but I feel like we did a financial policy on what would, I mean, Jennifer, I know had a bunch of thoughts on this. I had a bunch of thoughts on this, on what would and wouldn't be covered by a financial assistance policy.
I
Okay,
mean,
so maybe we should put a pin in it and go back and look unless David knows off the top of his head.
I don't recall at the top of my head, but I'll look into it.
I mean, like adult programs strike me as something that wouldn't apply, but children's maybe would, to that point when you get into base. So yeah, I think this is, I wasn't kidding. This could be a whole separate meeting and maybe should be. But I think in the essence of getting through this, but I
I mean,
appreciate,
I will just say, Sam, that last summer we had a whole discussion about this because initially some of the summer school programming was being charged fees for classes that were supposed to be offered during the school year and couldn't be, or something along those
That
lines.
was separate. That was
Well,
separate.
It wasn't separate. It was part of summer school at BHS.
Yeah, no, but that was a one-time issue of a class that.
But my
didn't-
point is, it wasn't clear. We had that whole discussion less than a year ago. And it required a reversal of an initial plan to charge people for classes. And so my point is, sometimes people think about the summer differently, and I'm saying we shouldn't necessarily think about the summer differently. These can be considered a sort of core part of someone's education. So anyway, to keep going on
no
the next
worries.
page.
Talked about AP exams a little bit, base is it's all separate conversation. Again, that's the most volatile. Again, it's a range and I'm putting my best estimate of 500,000. Performing arts, non-club, no changes there. Same with visual arts, same with CTE. Same with extracurricular, lost books. You see a pattern here. No fee for that. Tappan Green, no fee. The fees here, it's the goal here. Let's talk a little bit about Tappan Green. Their only reason being it's part of CTE for the students. What I'm trying to do here, and I'm very pleased in that, Donna and I have had meetings with Britt Stevens and Sasha Palmer and Hal Mason and Matt Gillis to go over, and Anthony Meyer for that matter, having consistency, because the issue, and it shouldn't be, we don't want one cannibalizing the other. Because they're both competing against each other and they should complement each other to the extent possible. So making sure that there's equity in standard lunch offerings, that students have, that there's consistency, and some, where you get into premium, you can differentiate, and I think, the prices should be comparable, but maybe they have unique offerings in both.
Yeah,
And then the catering, which isn't really here, but internal, and we're working on this. I'm just touching on it because this is, it speaks to the meetings we've had, is catering for during the school day in school building. We have a faculty meeting. That's done by our food service program, But if something's done off-site, which is to try to make it real world, which I think we all want, it's CTE, Career and Technical Education. That's being done by our TAP and Green, or that's where we're trying to have demarcations as best we can. Again, complement, not compete. And so just to make people aware that that's a work in progress. And I guess I'll stop there. Again, any more questions? I know you've been good about asking them along the way.
David, and then Helen, and then Susan.
If I might just jump back into a conversation we were having a short time ago. So regarding financial assistance for students, we do have an existing policy on that titled Student Financial Assistance. It can be found on J93. It was last voted on at least in 2016. So it's been a little while longer, but this does seem like something worth looking at. It talks about the superintendent setting a program and a centralized financial assistance application process.
That we have. But on the form, it speaks to those major categories, but I think Mariah and others' points are well taken. It may be, I don't believe students have been denied access, but we need to revisit the form to have it be consistent, which I can look at. We're doing that for next year as it stands right now.
Because this policy states that optional activities do not receive assistance. And then it explicitly mentions that included among those would be the prom and optional trips, such as sometimes world language classes will travel abroad, for instance.
Yeah.
That's not eligible either. And I would assume that summer school in many instances would be considered optional as well. So this is definitely something that we need to look into further.
Helen?
So actually, I'm glad you brought up summer school, David, because I was going to say something before and then I let it go. But summer school is divided up into two parts. It's the courses for students who failed their courses during the school year and want to make up that credit over the summer, and for students who want to take a course because they can't take it the following year. They want to take other courses, and so it's more of an enrichment type of thing rather than a remedial, I guess you could say, type of thing. So that's the way that at least I've known the summer school to be. And the ones that are for kids who didn't pass the course would not, to my best of my recollection, the students are not charged for that. Not 100% sure, but I think that's the case. With regards to the restaurant, that's mostly, I think it's only teachers who can, and staff who can eat in the restaurant, or it was in the past. Is this changing now since the new? Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I know the students who work in the program have access to eat in the program, but I think that it's still a work in progress with respect to access.
Okay. I guess it's changing. That's fine.
Before we get to Susan, I just want to say, Helen, that I think that perhaps we might be encouraging behavior if we're only charging people for enrichment and not charging them for remedial classes. We are perhaps encouraging or discouraging, disincentivizing in people's sort of active learning and participation over the summer, which might not be the best thing for a school system to do. Go ahead, Susan, you're up.
Good, thank you. So I think I'm trying to, in my mind, thought be a good committee member and sort of distinguish between things that we need to do this year and things that are kind of more general comments. And one thing that's a little bit hard about voting these is, Sam, as you said, I think you have more information in your head about benchmarks than we have. And so one thing that will be important probably the next time around is that we do see benchmarks for each of these, because sometimes we've made decisions. For example, we've had quite nuanced conversations in the past, just to take meal policy as one example, where we've benchmarked our high school to probably 6 or 8 other high schools. And then we've had a K-8 number, which is which is challenging because other school districts have an elementary price and they have a middle school lunch price because there are different amounts of food and there are different kinds of food. And we have a K-8 system. So we've had to kind of do some thoughtful blending when we think about our benchmarks. But so one piece of the puzzle is for any of these, certainly the bigger ticket items like food services, having benchmarks. But the other piece of it is to understand not only the revenue side, but actually understanding if this is the fee we charge, what does this mean for profit and loss? What does this mean for the solvency of that account? Because, and the reason that's important is that it may be true that, you know, we want to subsidize X program, but then when we look at it, it means we're subsidizing it pretty substantially at a $50 price point, whatever it is. And we've had that in the past where we've actually had to go back and sort of redo the cost sort of model of whatever the program was, because the juice wasn't worth the squeeze. The amount we were getting out of it from a strategic point of view was not actually enough to justify the subsidy we were having to give it. So I guess I would just strongly consider when we do kind of the next iteration of this, that when we're looking at fees or changing fees, that we're understanding both the benchmark side, which is kind of the revenue side, but we're also understanding the sort of solvency of that revolving fund, which really means understanding the cost model that we're putting against those revenues. I mean, here it's just a little hard to, it's a little hard to know what to quite to do with this, but because I think each one of these is in a slightly different place in terms of whether we would be subsidizing it or not. You know, your example, Sam, of food services is exactly right. And we had multiple iterations of how much the food services would be if we insourced it versus outsourced it. And there was a decision made to outsource it. And then there was a decision made, given the quality of what we were getting, that we brought it back in-house, as you probably remember. So those numbers and those financials are quite important as we kind of think about a multi-year approach to this. So anyway, I just want to provide that if it's helpful.
It is. I appreciate that. I mean, my only comment would be, and it's not unique to Brookline, food service is in every district the largest operating, the largest revolver, and can make or break a district, both good and bad. And so I understand that in the past, Brookline had some challenges with respect to solvency. I'm pretty optimistic this year won't be one of those years. But as we transition, next year could very well be a transition year where, you know, people aren't going to get a free meal. And so then you've got to, you know, unless you're on free or reduced lunch, and then you really have to, and I'm working with Sasha, working with Matt. I've got some experience with food service programs and turning them around, making them successful, is making it appealing enough that people, you know, will have the participation to make it solvent. And I've got some ideas about that. I'm cautiously optimistic we'll be able to drive participation up from where it was pre-pandemic. I'll leave it at that.
David, go ahead.
Just going to say, in the context of Susan's remarks about benchmarking, I also find it helpful to look at what other districts are charging for related fees. So in the past, when we've considered voting increases to BEEP tuition, for example, we've often seen what other local preschools and or daycares, some combination thereof, are charging, and whether they're half day or full day, whether it's daycare only or daycare plus preschool or preschool only. Having that context can help inform our votes.
Thank you.
I'm going to make a couple comments. My first one is that I think our overall budget year on year is going up 5%. We might have reasons, as Susan said, for not increasing some of these programs by that much, but at least for the international student tuition, I would propose that we increase that by 5% instead of the 3% proposed. Especially, I don't know if that was increased. Was that level funded from 2 years ago? Do you remember, Donna? Or does anyone remember? I think we might have had a no changes on all of them last year, that we just level funded them. Do you remember, Donna? Or do you have last year's memo right there?
Sorry. No, I don't. We could find out for you though.
Okay, but that one I think we could propose an increase on. And the other thing that I want to bring up, which ties in tightly with the review of this overall financial assistance policy, is as some of you, or maybe many of you know, there was a town school working group focused on BHA, Brookline Housing Authority. And one of the things that we talked about in that was how can we really reduce barriers, eliminate barriers for BHA residents to have sort of full access to town and school programming, you know, and thinking about how we can really just make that as seamless as possible for them. And I'd like to propose, and I'm going to do it at this moment for thinking about, even if it actually needs to go into that other policy or also needs to go in that other policy, that we look at eliminating fees in our programming for BHA residents. And so, you know, we're already talking about, I think you mentioned, Sam, that 40 of the PSB or the 40 of the BEEP slots are reserved. And so to what extent can we be looking at, for example, the base, is it Smart Summers and Smart Vacations, you know, the programming that they have there, you know, how can we be thinking about this across the board for BHA residents, and to basically not even to make it even a applicationless process where based on address, you're guaranteed in and you don't need to file all the paperwork to go through that. So I'm bringing that up here in the context of the fee discussion. I don't think we're going to vote tonight, A, because we're at 6:27, but B, because we had a lot of other questions going on. But that is going to be something that when we do vote on this, I do plan on bringing up again. And I'd be happy to hear feedback and comments on that. I see Helen's hand is up.
Yeah,
And Stephen.
I would ask that the heads of those programs, any of those programs, sort of either talk with Sam or talk to us about the implications of that for their programs.
Sounds good. Stephen.
Just a note of enthusiasm for that proposal, Mariah.
I agree, but I think we also have to be aware and we have to be
Sure.
fiscally responsible in terms of what that might mean.
Sure, but just in terms of, I agree with you, Helen, just in terms of aligning with our value on equity, Mariah, I think that's a really valuable proposal.
Okay, it's 6:28. Any last words before we wrap up for tonight? And in terms of this fees document, is this, I don't even remember, I'm sorry right now, is this on the agenda for tomorrow?
Usually.
No, is it?
No, it's not.
It's not, right? We pushed it off until February 6th or 4th or whatever it is, the 6th, 3rd, thank you. Okay, so it's not even on the agenda for tomorrow. So let's you'll get that. We'll give you some time, Donna and Sam, to iterate on it and to look into some of these issues. Okay. Any other last comments? Any other old business, new business before we conclude for tonight?
Yeah, just on that, I would say to the extent that you have benchmarks that are easy to provide to us, that would be helpful. Nothing new, but you've mentioned just so many interesting tidbits, even in the course of this meeting, or any sort of sense of solvency. We've made allusions to it, but I think those kinds of things are really helpful to us. And I think the default answer in a year like this is to make no change, or just to do a simple 2% change. And so I think much of what you said makes a lot of sense to me in terms of a strategy for this year. But I think whatever information you do have would be great. And then maybe going forward, we can define what kind of information we would want to have more strategically next year.
Andy, before I call on you, can I get a quick, like a straw poll if people are okay with my 5% increase on the international student? Okay. Okay, great. So generally it was accepted. Okay, that's great. Just as input to the team. Andy, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I was wondering if for material fees and BEEP in particular, whether we could find out like what the increases have been year on year or for the past 5 years or something like that, just to give some historical context as well as.
I would
the
appreciate that
benchmarking.
too for those
Yeah.
two
Sure,
programs. That would be
sure.
valuable.
Thanks.
Not just
Um,
percentage, but number, the actual amount, because sometimes the percentage sort of skews what the actual amount of increase is.
You mean a percentage can sound large, but it's actually like $30, that kind of a thing.
Exactly.
Yep.
Exactly.
Okay, so I just want to conclude by saying thank you to the PSB team for coming up with the budget book on time, and a wonderful start to the FY23 budgeting season. And may this be the beginning of a very smooth and uneventful next couple of months. And thank you for all that hard work. Super grateful.
Thank you.
Okay, and see everyone tomorrow.
Yeah.
Bye.
Night.